Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to King's and to this event hosted by the Policy Institute at King's. This is the fifth and final lecture in Dominique's 2015 lecture series, in which he's going to bring together the lessons he pointed out in his previous four lectures. Rather than listen to me talking and my voice fading very rapidly, at this stage I'll pass over to Dominique, who has a much stronger voice than I have.
I don't know. The title I gave 6 months ago to that final lecture was something like Beyond Chaos, How to Repair a Broken World. 6 months ago it sounded nice, a bit too ambitious, probably, but the lecture was only 6 months away. And then, of course, I had to write it, and I realized the task I had set for myself was simply impossible. So let me tell you in advance, I've given up. You will not come out of this class knowing how the world is going to be repaired. But I shall try to come as close as possible to what I wanted to say. The first thing I believe, and that's the conclusion of these four series, is that in order to try to attempt to repair the world, the first thing you have to do is to understand what has happened and why I could call that what went wrong. What are the main causes of the situation we are in today? And trying to go to the essential, I came to the conclusion that there were four possible lines of explanation. And it is the combination of them all that create the situation we are in today. The first line of explanation is that from a purely geopolitical standpoint, we can speak of the encounter between four phenomena. The first two are the collapse of two empires, the Ottoman Empire, and we see the long-term consequences of that in the Middle East today. The collapse of the Soviet Empire, and we see more rapidly the consequences of that in Eastern Europe today, and the re-emergence of a third empire with ambition to act as a regional hegemon, and that is, of course, China. And confronted with these three phenomena, collapse of two empires, re-emergence of a third one, you have the most important factor, which is the weakening of another empire, if one can use the expression empire when it comes to the United States. But it is the encounter between those four phenomena that constitutes the basic geopolitical background in which we are today. Look at Europe. The two threats surrounding us from the south and the east are the direct consequences of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and of the Soviet Empire. I think confronted with these change, we have clearly something that you can only describe as the relative weakening or decline of the United States. Should one therefore come to the conclusion that there is no alternative today to the United States balancing role? A very debatable issue, one that presented as such would be probably the subject of violent polemics. Do you want the problem to be part of the solution to the problem it has largely contributed to create? Is the United States not responsible in large part for what has happened in the last decade? Could America not be presented as an accelerator of disorder? In Asia yesterday, through the Vietnam War, in the Middle East today, through the adventures that took place in Iraq, in Afghanistan, not to mention the dubious role the United States has kept playing in Latin America. Yet, the fact that in the past few years, America moved from doing too much to probably doing too little is an unavoidable explanation for what we are witnessing today, which is that there is no principle of order incarnated by anyone any longer in the world. There's no principle of order. That's probably the central explanation for the disorder we have been witnessing. So the first answer to the question, what can be done, should probably be as follows. What can be done to repair America? And this is, of course, above all, a problem for the Americans themselves. They are the only one to be able to repair their republic. And they are the only one to find out, whereas their problem is above all of institutional nature, institutions that have not changed since the creation of the republic at the end of the 18th century, a personal one, moving from a president that was doing much too much to a president that may be doing too little, or a lack of a strategic concept, as some people are regretting today, the absence of an Obama doctrine to act upon the world. The answer to such questions are, of course, manifold. But before asking them, in a way, you have to ask yourself whether you are not putting too much responsibilities on the shoulder of the United States. Why should 300 million people be responsible for the fate, the life of more than 7 billion ones? It's unfair and unrealistic given the harsh evolution of the world and the evolution of the thinking in the United States about the world. No strategic doctrine is able to manage chaos. No declining power can decide for the sake of the world order without a direct threat to herself or her citizens to play such a central role. The American gendarme is tired of responsibilities, tired of criticism, tired of having to risk the life of its citizens for dubious causes or ungrateful others. Whatever I do, you will criticize me. Why should I do it? So, if America cannot be counted on to be a principle of order, or even a modern-day balancer in the 19th century British sense of the term. In other terms, if the answer cannot come from any individual state, can it come from strengthened and updated international institutions? Which takes me to my second set of interpretation. It is a paradox of sort when you consider the tradition of relative distance of the United States towards multilateralism, that the weakening of America and the weakening of multilateralism have been, in fact, concomitant with each other. There was a moment, a brief moment, when there was something like a glimmer of hope, when you felt that America was ready to espouse multilateralism. That was the end of the Clinton era. That was the time when Richard Holbrooke was ambassador at the UN, American ambassador at the UN, and was dealing on a daily basis with the then Secretary General, Kofi Annan. They worked hand in hand for a very, very brief period of time. And there was a moment where you could dream that the reality of power and the symbol of law would come together to create rules. But the dream was very quickly over. It didn't really materialize. It did not work. And today, the UN institutions give the impression of being weaker than they ever were. So you can ask yourself whether their lack of efficiency is the direct result or consequence of their lack of representativity and therefore of legitimacy. Why should we pay tribute to the international order that came out of World War II 70 years ago? The world has greatly changed. But because the composition of the UN Security Council proved impossible to reform, i.e. to enlarge, fora of dialogue have multiplied around it with a subsequent impression of cacophony. G7, G8, G20. Too often, the world gives the impression of being an enlarged version of the European Union. And this is not necessarily a compliment. the dream of the United Nations has given way to the reality of the disunited states of the world. And two phenomena, in fact, have jointly taken place to make the situation even worse. First, the number of states has literally exploded as a result of the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, the explosion of Yugoslavia, whatever. Just consider the Olympic ceremonies. You see flags you've never seen before. You hear national anthem you never heard before. And among those new states, those new flags, those new anthems, there are so many failed states. States that failed to materialize and to function properly. So you can come to another form of interrogation. It has been said in the past, after the independence of many African states, that the problem of Africa was that there were too many states for its good functioning. That the number of states was the result of the fact that political leaders coming from former empire, mostly French and British, wanted to be at the head of sovereign states, which were not justified, neither in historical, geographic, or whatever terms. Could this interrogation, at that time centered on Africa, be valid for the entire world? I was in the Balkans 2 weeks ago, and I felt in Serbia, where I was, a distinct form of nostalgia for Yugoslavia. Weren't we happier, more respected in the world, when we were together as one? My interlocutors told me. Then, and of course the Serbians are saying that, then we were responsible for 25 million people. We were taken seriously. Now my former Yugoslav diplomat tells me I speak for only 10 million people. But I'm told that there is the same nostalgia in Bosnia and even in Croatia. So the question comes to my mind: have we gone too far in the direction of recognizing that identity should necessarily lead to sovereignty? An interesting question in Great Britain today. It's not the more the merrier, but the more confused. The more numerous the actors, the more difficult to reconcile their diverging interests. At the same time, there is another dimension, which is the entrance at the top of the table of new actors such as India or Brazil, who are leading countries, but who are not necessarily playing by the rules, in the sense that for them sovereignty has been gained, especially in the case of India, relatively recently, less than 70 years ago. Why would you happily relinquish something that you fought so hard to gain? And the problem is that probably in the global age, sovereignty means much less that it did previously, but is sought for much more. So you have negotiations that are leading nowhere, such as the Doha round on trade, which may have been fatally damaged by the new composition of force, leading to a de facto paralysis in the world. From that standpoint, I think it would be very interesting to wait for the results of the Paris Summit on climate change. A universal cause, but a deeply divisive issues along geopolitical line. If one look for the cause of disorder beyond the lack of a clear principle of order and the crisis of multilateralism, one should, I believe, stress a third dimension, one which is of a geo-economic, social, cultural, and above all, ethical dimension. And here I come to my third factor, which I define as the explosion of inequalities in our global age. Global age means an interdependent and transparent world. Societies have been deeply unequal before, but never in such a transparent world. And it is this interaction between globalization and inequality that constitutes a very dangerous mixture, what I would call a demobilizing brew for some, even a source of rebellion and upsurge for others. Life is too good for too few and too difficult for too many. How can you create a sense of common good, common belonging, common responsibility in such a context? Figures are everywhere, but let me just give you one which struck me because they concern the United States of America, the country of the American dream, the country of equality, of opportunities among citizens. In 1970, in an average American firm, the gap between the highest salary and the lowest one was between 1 and 40. 40 to 1. In 2007, it was between 400 and 1. Today, it's 601. It's an accelerating process of inequality. And inequalities become all the more so intolerable that they are most often accompanied by corruption. And this mixture leads regime who want, of course, to stay in power, to use nationalism, sectarism, tribalism as a sort of diversion, if not protection for themselves. Yes, I know you are very poor, but you should be proud. Look at what our country is doing. Look, our flag is flying over cities that were always ours and that for some reason stopped belonging to us. Or, you are poor, I know it, but it is not because of you. but of the others. It's not me, it's them, their sanctions, their aggressivity, etc., etc., etc. I would come to a fourth line of reasoning. Why is the world so difficult? What has gone wrong? So after a classical geopolitical interpretation, after institutional interpretation on multilateralism, after the description of the responsibility of inequalities, I would emphasize the individual, human factor. Could you say that the watering down of power has been made clearer by the fact that so far no exceptional leader has emerged faced to the challenge of exceptional circumstances? Would you say that the time, the era of the big leader is over? Or should one say, by contrast, that this is just the reverse? Leaders, by their absence, are making the difference. Let me try, at this point, beyond those four reasons, to try to lead you towards my conclusion and to summarize the four solutions which I envisage to go beyond the chaos of our present world. In a dream world, there would be an America regaining a sense of a universal mission, but exerting it with a combination of confidence and modesty. There would exist a China understanding that with power comes responsibility, and a China exerting power with a mixture of restraint and yet altruism. There would exist equally a series of regional leaders having a specific role to play for their regions, like Brazil in South America or Nigeria in Africa. There would be a European Union transcending our present culture of fear to return to be an actor, and not only a soft power, but also a hard power in a world that is more and more difficult. A European Union transcending our divisions and taking direct responsibility for our security. As for the Middle East, the key challenge would be to contain and successfully confront the forces of fundamentalism or ultranationalism, wherever they exist, all over the entire region. To prolong my conclusion, I would like to make a short parenthesis and ask Henry Kissinger to help me. In his last book, World Order, he makes the following points, which I think are very important to the understanding of our present world. He says, every international order must sooner or later face the impact of two tendencies challenging its cohesion. Either a redefinition of legitimacy or a significant shift in the balance of power. The problem today is that these two factors are occurring at the same time, reinforcing each other in their destabilizing impact. To strike a balance between the two aspects of order, power and legitimacy, is the essence of statesmanship, continues Kissinger. And here again, the problem is that we are going through exceptional circumstances with unexceptional leaders, which may be the last and most important factor to explain what's wrong with the world. Let me go back, and this is my real conclusion, to my initial question, which was, beyond chaos, how to repair a broken world. For the sake of parallelism, since I gave 4 explanations to the problems besetting the world, let me end with 4 suggestions on what is to be done. The first answer may be to deny the formulation of the question. Maybe the world is not broken. Far from it. There are progress taking place within it. From demography to technology, there are continents which are doing much better than they were doing before. Even Africa, or for that matter, Asia. So what we need is not to repair a broken world, but to muddle through a difficult period. Muddle through from the Middle East to the South China Sea, from the African part of the world to whatever. Just keeping in mind the answer given by the German philosopher Hans Magnus Eisenberger to the question that he was asked in response to the bloodshed in the Balkans in the early 90s. He said to the question, what would you do? He said, nothing. Nothing, of course. Let blood exhaust blood. When too much blood would have been spilled, it's the nature of things, will quiet down. Can you accept that philosophical passivity in the age of internet, Facebook, and whatever? The answer is probably no. So exit the first solution. A second solution, more daring, more practical, maybe, would be for the United States to accept that she has to share power with at least one emerging actor. In the last decades, we have moved from bipolarity with the Soviet Union to unipolarity between 1990 2001, and now to something that is often described as apolarity. There's no one in charge. Should we go back to some form of bipolarity and the most legitimate actor that exists apart from the United States is China. Of course, such a bipolar order would be for quite some time an asymmetrical one. China and the United States of America are very different. But this asymmetrical nature was also the case at the time when the bipolar world was incarnated by the United States and the Soviet Union. So you simply shift the nature of one actor out of the two, and you reach some kind of bipolar solution. Wouldn't it be more legitimate to bring in the Chinese and to have them play a responsible role? A third solution would consist in reinventing multilateralism for our time. Since the UN cannot be reformed, let us use other institutions such as the G20, and let's try to give them at the same time representativity and legitimacy by creating around them true instrument and mechanism for action. It will not be a panacea, of course, but it could help to take us out of the present chaos. A fourth solution would be to emphasize the return to a world dominated by ideas and ideals, values and principles. But these values and principles adjusted to the realities of our time. Rousseau and Kant saw in the absence of democracy the cause of war. Should we not say today, should we not emphasize today that it is the absence of the rule of law that is ultimately the main source for chaos and disorder? Of course, these four roads are not necessarily exclusive of each other. In fact, a little bit of these four directions would probably be useful for a world that may not be in chaos, but that is clearly at a crossroad. And it is interesting that we are still looking for the right analogy to understand the direction in which our world is going. I think I have reached the end of my time. I should stop here. I recognize that I may have been too ambitious in my quest, but I have tried honestly to analyze what went wrong in the world, and I came after those 5 lectures to these inconclusive conclusions. Thank you very much.
Dominique, you've certainly been thought-provoking, even if you haven't reached a final conclusion. At this stage, can we open up the meeting to questions? Can I take the first question from the gentleman here?
Hi, could you say a bit about the role of global corporations?
No, I'm just going to take one first.
Thank you for your.
Sorry, I thought you were pointing.
No, but whatever, we can take two. Yeah, please.
Thank you for your great the lecture, also convincing the lecture. I just wondered, what exactly means the G8, the great 8 countries. For example, Japan entered G8. So why China cannot? I'm not Chinese. China cannot enter. Historically, and then culturally, economically, educationally, industrially, China was much higher than in Japan. So how can Japan enter and then China could not enter? Also, who decided to enter, the G8? I always wondered. Can you explain, please? Thank you.
Dominique.
On the role of global cooperation, they play a very important role, but they are not meant to be directly geopolitical actors. They may be acting behind the scene. They may be too influential on governments and power at time, but the solution will not come from them. I think to some extent one could say they are part of the problem, not part of the solution. Global cooperation realize the extent of their influence. They don't want to be taken for Mother Teresa and be called upon to solve the misery of the world. And knowing them a little bit, we're not expecting that from them. But the question you raise is really, could we speak of an international order in the classical sense of the term as we were doing in the 19th century or even in the 20th century? The multiplication of actors on the world scene has made the game all the more important. But if you look at ISIS, the caliphate, in fact, I find it particularly interesting that they've seized a territory and they used an analogy in relation to a very classical actor of the time, an imperial, ideological, religious actor. So somewhere the categories of the past seem to me probably more useful today than they might have sounded 10 or even 20 years ago, because of the return with a vengeance of feeling of sovereignty in a world where sovereignty exists less and less, feeling of emotions to identity, you back to something much more classical, but presented in a new form, in a new disguise. I realize in saying that I belong to an old, realistic school of international relations. But I accept the accusation of being old-fashioned, because I think the past still remains one of the best tools to predict the future. And it is particularly true when it comes to my subject. I mean, I read recently the notes I took for the preparation of a seminar I gave as a very young professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 1973, long time ago. and the subject was diplomacy of the Ancien Régime. It's so relevant for an understanding of the world today. You can't imagine. It was very, very interesting. The comparison between Italy at the Congress of Versailles and Israel today. Two countries engaging in a process of self-isolation from the world. Just the opposite of France at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. So I think those categories are still valid. When it comes to the second question, your question, why is Japan in and China out? Well, one of the key definitions of membership has been democracy, market economy, and the rule of law. We proceeded to integrate Russia, and we ended up rejecting Russia. That's the answer. And you noted that in my presentation, I emphasized the role of China, not the role of Japan, out of sheer realism. But there's a very interesting book that came out a few months ago on Russia on the eve of World War I and the entrance and the causes for the collapse of the Russian Empire. And one comparison is made in that book, which I find very challenging for our time. It has been said very often that the comparison valid was between China today and Germany in 1914. And the assertion this book by Dominique Moisi is making is that the true comparison is between China and Russia, not China and Germany. And this comparison is, in the mind of the writers, even more dangerous. Russia went to war to save her empire, the cohesiveness and the unity of the Russian land. Could it be the same for China today if growth was slowing down to dangerous point, and if the regime was finding that the only alternative to save the empire from dissolution from within was war with the outside? And the comparison with Russia is more frightening than the comparison with Germany.
We'll take two questions before.
Hi. There is a discussion recently about whether our assumption that democracy is the best form of governance in the world. If you look at, for example, the US, it's all based on interest groups. If you look at places like Hungary, Turkey, it's all based on popularism taking over actual democratic ideals. In a way, democracy shoots itself in the foot at some point. And then you look at the rising powers where like places like Singapore, China, India, on differing levels, rule of law, checks and balances might not work as well. But people are happy as long as they are prosperous. Even if you look at Egypt, for example, people prefer Sisi to Muslim Brotherhood because they prefer security and some sort of normality to their life than democratically elected government. So do you think it is possible to have a world order where democracy is the accepted form, where we strive with the UN and other multilateral organizations, we strive towards a common goal?
Gentleman on the fourth row.
Hi. I was intrigued by your last point that the problem is not with the absence of democracy, but the absence of the rule of law. Could I ask that you elaborate a bit more about that? Particularly, how do we pick the lawmakers without democracy? And how do we pick the judges to enforce these laws? Presumably, we want them to be independent.
Well, the two questions are very linked. 2 weeks ago, when I gave my fourth lecture, it was on the eve of the British vote. And in the morning of Thursday, I went into London, and I took the tube, and there were huge posters all over London advertising the new series House of Cards. And you saw Frank Underwood, the hero of the series, in his famous sentence, looking at you, staring at you, democracy is seriously overrated. That's a famous line when he's nominated vice president without having run for the office before. And I came out in the city and went to the National Portrait Gallery, where I always go, and there was a polling station there. And I felt the exact opposite of the slogan in the tube. There were two bobbies, one man, one woman, standing in front of the polling station, and there was still one man with his party color trying to convince the voters as they were entering the polling station. And I must say, I felt emotionally very good. There was something so natural, so normal in the exercise of democracy that I felt that should be the universal norm. Why can't every country in the world have access to that simplicity of action? And I came to the conclusion, which was the exact opposite of the slogan of Frank Underwood in the tube. But then I come to what I said today. And I think it's the result of a series of trips, I must say, to Singapore, and a very long and personal conversation with Lee Kuan Yew, nearly 5, 6, well, time is flying, probably 8 years ago, 7 years ago. And really a 2-hour face-to-face conversation with Lee Kuan Yew. And the subject was that, democracy or the rule of law. And he said to me, well, the British have given us an incredible advantage. We understand the rule of law naturally, thanks to them. It will take the Chinese at least 3 generations to get to an understanding of the rule of law. And the rule of law is basic. I think illiberal democracy, to use the formula, the title of the book by Farid Zakaria, which means democracy that are only characterized by the activities of selecting the people you vote for. But then Iran is a case in point. It's a perfectly illiberal democracy. It's a religious autocracy, except the voters really have a decisive influence in selecting whom they are going to vote for, but within a relatively closed-in system. The rule of law means that the citizens know that the people who rule are acting in the sense of the common good, that they are selected along meritocratic and fair criteria, that you don't have to bribe them in order to get a decision. And I think the absence of the rule of law is a deadly poison for countries such as China, India, Brazil, Russia, whatever. More dangerous for their future than the absence of democracy or pretending democracy. I feel much better in India than in China because it is a democracy. There is a free press. But I know the rise of inequalities. I fear the pressure of corruption there, as I do feel it in Brazil. And it's not normal. It's not a workable system. So the problem for me is not Sisi in power in Egypt. Though, in a way, and this is something I wrote down, but on the left side of my page, and I forgot to read it. And that was that in the Middle East, autocracy is not the solution. It's part of the problem. The Arab Spring, which failed nearly everywhere except maybe in Tunisia, were the direct result of the revolutionary feeling against the combination of authoritarianism and corruption. The rebellion was both political and ethical. And this is something you have to take into consideration. So from that standpoint, the rule of law is the minimal basis for progress.
We have time just for one more question. Is that lady?
I want to ask some question about the point you made about national identity and sovereignty. So you said that national identity should not necessarily lead to sovereignty, and I was just wondering whether you would be able to elaborate a bit more on this point. For example, in the context of the Israel-Palestine debate, the conflict in Israel-Palestine, whereby so much of the conflict is characterized by this very problem of identity. So if according to your statement, identity does not necessarily lead to sovereignty, then, for example, in the context of this conflict, what do you make of the role of national identity in that case?
Well, in that particular case,
Thank you.
I've always wished and still stand for the fact that identity should lead to sovereignty. Otherwise, you reach a solution which I personally find suicidal for Israel in the long run, for the democratic nature of Israel, or for the Jewish character of the Jewish state. And so it's interesting. In that particular case, I had always fought for a two-state solution. I'm depressed about it today. Who wouldn't be? But I've not given up because the alternative is too tragic. So no, but I'm thinking and we can't go on. But I'm thinking of Scotland, for example. Why should there be a new country like Scotland? Catalonia. Why should there be a new country like Catalonia? Federal solutions, if they are based on equilibrium, fairness, and fairness of representativity, seem to me better solutions than the creation of new national entities. So this is what I had in mind, and not the Middle East in that case.
Dominic, thank you very much for a very thought-provoking final lecture. Unfortunately, I missed one or two of your earlier lectures, but you certainly gave me a lot to think about tonight, and I look forward to the book when it comes out.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for this evening.
Thank you.